Hi friends, my name is Emily and welcome to my channel. I was asked to be a 2020 TIFA Delegate and I was so excited looking through the list of all of the events. There were quite a few that popped out to me, and the two that I was especially excited about were the Age of Creativity with Emily Urquhart and Subverting Fairy Tales with Amanda Leduc and Natalie Zina Walschots. I actually ended up reading all three books. I was thinking of these as totally different things. What I realized that all three books have in common is stigma. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about each book and then talk about that overarching theme of stigma. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Age of Creativity. So this is a kind of odd little book. In some ways it's musing on art. When is an artist at their peak, and looking at how young artists, young prodigies are valued. Like in the Eurocentric art culture, how young artists are super valued and put on a pedestal, and how older artists are seen to have peaked and are not producing things of value anymore. And so she, in some ways, is looking to challenge that. In some ways, it's a biography of her father, Tony Urquhart.
He didn't grow up in, a home filled with artists. He actually grew up in a funeral home.
Who is a famous Canadian abstract expressionist painter. And in many ways it's memoir. It's musing on her own life growing up in the house of so many artists, and having art touch her life always. I really enjoyed that sort of mixed experience, learning a little bit about Urquhart, learning about Tony Urquhart, learning about the Canadian art scene within a certain time period, learning about abstract expressionist art, and then also learning about the ways that the art world has responded specifically to artists living with Alzheimer's and dementia. What stands out to me from the book is the artists with dementia whose late works were dismissed. They have them for the sake of collecting like the entire body of works, but that they don't have artistic value. And Urquhart seems to be pushing back against that.
I think 80 is that mark that people see a before and after with, where they're like, oh, he's in his 80s now.
Right.
And my dad was carrying on as he had for years. He has an incredible work ethic. He gets up in the morning, he eats, but after that, it's time to make art, and that's what he does for the entire day, every day.
Wow.
And that's what he continued to do into his 80s. And so people were saying, isn't that remarkable? And I thought, yeah, that's remarkable. And I would agree with it. And then after a while, I thought, no, I don't think they mean remarkable. Like, it's not that it was a negative thing, but they thought it was curious, like kind of strange and kind of also exciting that the old guy could still do it, could still be creating anything at all after 80. And at first I kind of went along with it, like, yeah, look at it go. And then I stopped to consider the fact that it was like, why were we finding this remarkable? Maybe it's just normal.
That art produced in this late stage of an artist's life, it's a unique opportunity for a snapshot into their mind, into their creative mind. And like, that it shouldn't be something that's dismissed. And she talked about how as her father's cognitive function declined, her family made the choice to hide it because he was still producing art and they wanted that art to be respected. So very much, again, highlighting that stigma on, I guess, a neurodivergence. What I really appreciated about this book was having the opportunity to think about late stage artists. It makes sense that somebody who has had a career that has spanned decades would be producing their greatest works, having creative breakthroughs at the end of their career, because they've had a whole life, they've had a whole career of honing their craft, of critiquing their craft. And it's bizarre that art from the end of an artist's career is stigmatized or dismissed. So I really, really loved this work. It got me thinking a lot about creativity, got me thinking a lot about prodigy of all things. I went to the other end rather than late stage of Life artist. I went to first stage of Life artist. If you are at all artsy, I would definitely recommend picking up The Age of Creativity by Emily Urquhart. It will feed your brain, and if you are like many of us during quarantine, during COVID, work from home, shelter in place, all that jazz, and you have picked up some artsy hobbies, I think it's interesting to just read about other artists, other artsy folks doing the art. So the next thing that I read for the second interview that I attended, which was Subverting Fairy Tales with Amanda Leduc and Natalie Zina Walschots, was Disfigured, on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space by Amanda Leduc. It's like a blending of pop cultural analysis with memoir. This is an own voices text. Leduc does identify as disabled. The whole text is very much shaped by the experience of growing up as a disabled child alongside being fed fairy tales, which are throughout a lot of children's media. Disney has got its sticky little fingers on so much of childhood. Like, I mean, how many kids haven't seen The Lion King, Peter Pan, The Little Mermaid, right? And I think the thing is that because it's sanitized, especially with Disney, it's sanitized, it's child safe, we don't often think about the subtle messages in these Disney texts.
We have so many characters in fairy tales that are disabled. It's just that you don't see them as disabled. You're taught as a viewer and as a reader to not think of them as disabled. You think of them as the villain. You think of them as the bad guy.
That all of the villains are disfigured or disabled in some way. In the case of The Little Mermaid, Leduc pointed this out, and I never thought of The Little Mermaid as disfigured. But when it comes to walking on land, being where the people are, having that tail is a disability. It prevents Ariel from movement, from accessing where the people are. Reframing The Little Mermaid in terms of like a magical cure, that she trades her voice and she trades away her disfigurement for legs. You know, to explore that world up above, she has to magically cure her disfigurement. There's no wheelchair, which would definitely also allow the Little Mermaid to move on land. Right? So again, so much food for thought in terms of stigmatized bodies, stigmatized identities, and how those narratives are subtly fed to children. It is such a good read. I think especially as an able-bodied person, I haven't had the experience of not feeling represented by the fairy tales, the characters that I see in the world around me, and something that Leduc pointed out in her interview.
Interestingly, there seems to be a real lack of imagination when you look at the very imaginative world of the fairy tale when it comes to integrating disability in a positive way, right? Like looking at a princess who maybe uses a wheelchair or a crutch and doesn't have her wheelchair or her crutch magically disappear through some sort of, puff of a fairy godmother's wand. I think there's still a lot that can be done in this arena.
Fairy tales are these fantasy spaces. Like, why not in a Disney movie have a talking guide dog? Like, you could have a blind princess, you could have a blind Disney princess, and it wouldn't break the world to have a talking guide dog sidekick, right? Like, she pointed out how ridiculous it is that these fantasy spaces are so flexible, they're so malleable already. So many fairy tales have talking animals doing wacky things. I mean, think of Puss in Boots and all that Puss in Boots achieves. Like, that's not realistic in any way. So like, why don't we make those magical accommodations in our fantasy spaces, especially in our narratives for kids? So this was so good. If you are at all interested in memoir, if you are interested in fairy tales, I would recommend checking this out. It will definitely feed your brain. It will give you something to think about. It might give you a really great excuse to go back and watch some of those Disney films and think about them a little bit differently, think about them critically. Would highly recommend that you pick this up. Okay, so the last book that I read was Hench by Natalie Zina Walschots. So this tells the story of Anna, who is a hench for a supervillain.
If you think about what superheroes do to hench people, in terms of like their physical bodies for longer than a second, most superhero narratives become really horrifying really fast. And all those things were extremely interesting to me. This kind of idea that there's this whole type of character who is, you know, whose identity hinges on being disposable.
At the start of the story, she does temp work, but things change when she gets a more permanent contract position. She is brought into the field by this supervillain. Anna ends up getting by one of the superheroes, Super Collider, and he absolutely crushes her leg, and she spends a significant amount of time in recovery tallying up the total life cost, the total damages that superheroes are causing the world when they are doing their heroics. So this book ends up thinking a lot about the experience of having your body altered in a life-altering way, in that Anna now lives with chronic pain. Anna now has to use a cane. In this case, we see the technology, the magic of this world being used to not cure, but accommodate. This is a good example of what Leduc was asking us to think about with fairy tales, that like, this is a speculative fiction place. Why don't we make more accommodations under the, like, this umbrella where a genre has like the most flexibility? Does that make sense? That we have a disabled protagonist who is still pulling off these plots. She's still badass and also disabled, and the technology, the magic of the world, makes the accommodations.
Because of the way that the built environment has historically disenfranchised and othered the disabled body, it's been very easy for people to say, rather than undertake the work of overhauling the system in which we live, it's much easier to imagine a world in which there is no disability at all. And that kind of connects to, you know, the fairy tale happy ending, in that the problem is solved by magic. It connects to the superhero narrative too, I think, where you have this idea where, you know, there's essentially a messiah who comes and fixes everything for everybody, and that takes away that collective responsibility of the world to change.
Really enjoyed this book. If you are at all into Marvel, into superheroes, I would recommend that you check this out. If you want a good example of somebody who has done the thing, because I feel like I often talk about how thing bad. I talk about how this is what this text is doing, this is how it negatively impacts people, here's how within this speculative fiction genre we could use the flexibility of the genre to just make it more inclusive. And it's often hard to point to examples. I can point to a lot of bad examples of like, thing bad, don't do this. This is an actual example of thing good. It's actually doing the thing that this genre has the flexibility to allow. On top of that, it is very funny, and also there's just like casual queerness everywhere. So many good things are happening here. So I would definitely recommend that you check out Hench. It sort of ended up being a weird coincidence that all three texts touch on stigma. And I think it's kind of interesting to see this sort of in three stages, actually. Leduc was born disabled. That is her whole life experience. Natalie Walschots' character, Anna, acquires a disability in the middle of her life as like a young adult, and Emily Urquhart's father experiences disability that comes with age. And so did not plan this at all, but we end up seeing the stigma of disability at various points in the human experience. I am no disability studies expert by any means. Looking at the ways in which this is not a good experience at any point because of how society is currently structured, has me definitely wanting to do more research on how I can be a better ally. So if you are interested in any of these books, I will leave the titles listed in the description box down below. I will also leave a link to TIFA if you want to follow them. So yeah, if you have read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts on them. If you have any other books that you think really tackle disability, disfigurement, stigma, please leave those in the comments down below. We can create sort of an interesting bibliography if other folks have an interest in this topic now, in reading a little bit more diversely. I would love to create that resource, not only for myself, but for anyone watching this video. Fiction, nonfiction, everything is welcome in terms of recommendations, although I personally would be interested in fiction recommendations. Like if you have some great fiction with great disability rep, please. I would love it. So before we go, I want to thank TIFA for inviting me to be a delegate, for allowing me to enjoy this time, enjoy this content and these events, and for asking me to make this video. This video is made possible by TIFA. So thank you to TIFA. If you liked what you saw here today, go give TIFA a follow. I will leave all their things down below so that you can support them. If you liked this, I'd also like a like. That would be awesome. And if you want to see more bookish content, more critical engagement with things, in addition to just fun bookish reading wrap-ups, you could subscribe. That would be cool. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you are all staying safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.